It was rough. Musicians union was there, but they weren't of much help at the time. I was never happy. I guess what drives me to tear things apart.
He revolutionized the guitar, inspired millions, and redefined rock itself. Yet behind Eddie Van Halen's infectious grin and mind-bending solos lay rivalries few ever knew about. There were 6 guitarists he admired, competed with, and at times couldn't stand. What drove this hidden tension between legends? And why did some of rock's greatest names end up on Eddie's secret hate list? Join us as we find out the 6 guitarists Eddie Van Halen hated the most. Number 6. Eric Clapton. Before Eruption, before the screaming crowds, a teenage Eddie Van Halen was sitting in his Pasadena bedroom with a cheap guitar and a worn stack of Cream records. Night after night, he dropped the needle on Crossroads, trying to capture every bend and fiery lick from Eric Clapton's Les Paul. Clapton wasn't just an influence, he was the reason Eddie picked up the guitar. He once told Guitar World, "Clapton was my main influence. I used to sit there for hours trying to figure out what he was doing. I'd play that solo on Crossroads note for note. He was God to me." In those early years, Eddie didn't care about fame or tone or songwriting. He wanted to understand what made Clapton's playing feel alive. The phrasing, the sustain, and the pauses shaped his musical DNA. But time changes everything. By the late 1970s, Eddie Van Halen had done something even Clapton hadn't. He reinvented the electric guitar. When Eruption hit, it sounded like it came from another world. His two-handed tapping, harmonic squeals, and dive bombs redefined guitar technique. Suddenly, this shy kid from Pasadena became the future of rock. Fans worshipped him, but not everyone cheered. The old guard, musicians Eddie once idolized, listened with skepticism. In 1980, when Clapton was asked about Van Halen, his response stunned Eddie. Clapton said, "He's very good technically, but I don't hear much soul." It was a casual remark, but it cut deep. For Eddie, it was heartbreaking. The man who'd shaped his style now dismissed his music as mechanical. Years later, he admitted, "It kind of broke my heart. I learned everything from him. I wasn't trying to outplay him. I was inspired by him. To hear that he didn't like what I was doing really got to me." Eddie never fired back. He never insulted Clapton in interviews, but friends say he quietly wrestled with the disappointment and how strange it felt to be rejected by his hero. Part of the clash came from philosophy. Clapton's guitar work was built on restraint, a blues-rooted style where tone and phrasing told the story. Eddie's was about freedom, distortion, feedback, and fearless experimentation. In a sense, they represented 2 eras: Clapton, the sound of the 60s, Eddie, the sound of the future. Yet even through the pain, the admiration never faded. In 1995, Eddie admitted, "Clapton's tone on Crossroads, that's still untouchable. I don't care what anybody says. That's pure feeling. You can't fake that." The 2 men eventually met in Los Angeles in the mid-1980s. Eddie was hopeful, like a fan meeting his idol for the first time. Clapton was polite, but distant. They talked about guitars, tone, and amps, but not about emotion. Afterwards, Eddie told a friend, "He's just a man. I think I loved the myth more than the person." That moment changed him. It was when Eddie stopped seeing legends as gods and started seeing them as humans, brilliant but flawed. Later, when asked if Clapton's words still bothered him, Eddie laughed softly, "Nah, maybe he didn't get it. Maybe I didn't get him either. We're from different planets, man." That line captured them perfectly. 2 guitar gods from different worlds. Clapton painted with blues and shadows. Eddie splashed neon across the sky. After Eddie's passing in 2020, Clapton reportedly spoke warmly of him in private, calling him a true innovator. Though he never made a public statement, fans who knew their story understood the gesture. By then, Eddie had long made peace with it. In 2001, he told Guitar World, "If Clapton hadn't existed, neither would I. Whatever he thinks of me doesn't change that." By the end, Eddie's admiration hadn't vanished. It had matured. "I'll always be chasing what I heard on those old Cream records," he once said. That's where the fire started. Eddie's heartbreak over Clapton ran deep, but his next feud burned hotter. This time, it wasn't disappointment. It was pure rivalry. Two guitar gods, one stage, and no room for compromise. What happens when Eddie Van Halen goes head-to-head with the dark wizard of the Stratocaster? Number 5. Richie Blackmore. There are few things more nerve-wracking for a young guitarist than meeting a hero, especially when that hero is Richie Blackmore, the moody and unpredictable genius behind Deep Purple and Rainbow. For a teenage Eddie Van Halen, Blackmore wasn't just another rock star. He was a prophet of tone. Eddie would study Burn and Highway Star, note for note, replaying them until his fingers bled. He admired the precision of Blackmore's solos, the bite of his distortion, and that haunting sense of drama that hung over every riff. To Eddie, Richie was one of the few who could make a guitar sound truly alive. When Van Halen's debut album exploded in 1978, Eddie suddenly found himself standing alongside the men he'd grown up idolizing. He was no longer a kid with a Strat copy in his bedroom. He was a peer, a chart-topping guitarist rewriting the rules of rock. But the dream soured quickly when he finally met one of his gods. In a 1982 interview with guitar players Jazz Obrecht, Eddie recalled their first encounter. "He just stared at me," Eddie said. "Wouldn't say hi, nothing. I was crushed. I thought, wow, I looked up to this guy my whole life, and he just blew me off." That silence hit harder than any insult. Eddie wasn't arrogant, he was disarmingly open. A guy who could talk gear and pick up wiring for hours. He jammed with anyone and laughed easily. What stayed with him about Richie was the chill, the blank stare, the lack of warmth, the total absence of connection. Years later, Eddie mentioned it again. "People like Joe Perry and Richie Blackmore just gave me the shaft with their eyes," he told Rock and Roll Garage. "Wouldn't say hello, wouldn't be nice, no nothing. I'm not that way." That phrase, "the shaft with their eyes," summed up the sting perfectly. Eddie had just unleashed Eruption, a solo that detonated guitar technique and forced every rock musician to rethink what was possible. Yet his heroes, the men whose posters had once hung on his wall, looked at him with something colder than rivalry, dismissal. Part of it was Richie's personality. Blackmore was famously difficult, even with his own bandmates. His mystique depended on distance, and when he was asked years later what he thought of Van Halen, his response felt like both a compliment and a jab. "He's a fine player," Blackmore said, "but I think he plays too many notes." Fans argued for years over that line. Was it jealousy or old-school snobbery? In truth, it revealed a deeper divide in the split between two eras of rock guitar. Blackmore's style was shaped by classical phrasing and restraint. Every bend and vibrato was deliberate. Eddie's playing was the opposite, fluid, explosive, and unbound. Where Richie crafted control, Eddie embodied freedom. It wasn't exactly a feud, more a generational standoff. Eddie was the face of a new movement, the Californian innovators who rewired their amps, built their own guitars, and chased tones no one had ever heard. Blackmore was the last of the disciplined British hard rock purists, his fretwork rooted in precision and structure. Still, Eddie never turned that cold encounter into bitterness. In a 1995 Guitar World interview, he looked back with understanding. "I was probably just too sensitive back then. Maybe he was shy or didn't know what to say, but man, I worshiped that guy growing up. Still do." And over time, even Richie softened. In 2008, he told Classic Rock magazine, "Eddie Van Halen brought something new. I can't deny that. What he did with the whammy bar, the tapping, it was clever. He found his own voice. It was recognition. The very thing Eddie had once hoped for." Their paths diverged, yet they stayed bound by influence. Blackmore drifted into medieval ballads and Renaissance melodies with Blackmore's Night, chasing elegance over aggression. Eddie stayed restless, forever tinkering with his guitars and tone circuits, chasing the sound no one else could find. And he did. By the time the world lost Eddie Van Halen in 2020, even die-hard Blackmore fans had accepted what their hero finally admitted. He was brilliant. He found something that everyone else was trying to find. The words came decades late, but for Eddie Van Halen, they were enough. But Eddie would soon face a different kind of rejection, one loud, swaggering, and soaked in attitude. Number 4. Joe Perry. In 1978, Van Halen was the new thunderstorm rolling across rock's skyline, raw, electrifying, and impossible to ignore. The band's debut album had just begun to shake the airwaves, and Eddie Van Halen, barely 23, was still the hungry kid from Pasadena, trying to prove he belonged among the guitar gods. Each night on tour, he tore through solos like his life depended on it. But behind the amps and flashing lights, something quietly stung him. The cold indifference of the men he'd grown up idolizing, players like Joe Perry of Aerosmith. Eddie once told Jazz Obrecht in a 1982 guitar player interview how that early tour felt. People like Joe Perry would just give me the shaft with their eyes, he recalled. Wouldn't say hello, wouldn't be nice. No nothing. I'm not that way. Imagine being the young prodigy on the road, playing with everything you have, night after night. And when you finally bump into the heroes whose posters hung on your wall, they don't even look your way. No nod, no smile, just that cold, unreadable stare. He felt that Perry and others like Richie Blackmore saw him as a threat. In that same interview, he put it bluntly, they wouldn't go out of their way to help anybody, 'cause they would feel threatened. It wasn't just bitterness, it was an honest read of the generational shift happening in the late 70s. Eddie's style, fluid, fearless, and rooted in invention, had redrawn the map of electric guitar playing. The old guard was blues and swagger. The new one was speed, precision, and sonic experimentation. Perry, a cornerstone of the 70s hard rock, came from a school built on riff-heavy grooves and raw attitude. His tone was thick, swampy, and full of sleaze, the soundtrack of cigarette smoke and backstage chaos. Eddie's, by contrast, was lightning in stereo, his two-hand tapping, his use of harmonics and whammy bar dives, and his obsession with tone shaping made his sound futuristic, almost alien. To some veterans, it didn't feel like evolution, more like an invasion. Eddie never confronted Perry publicly, never lashed out, but privately, he couldn't shake how strange it felt to be treated like an outsider by the very people who'd inspired him. He wasn't asking for mentorship, just a handshake, a moment of shared respect. Instead, he walked away with a quiet resolve. If they wouldn't open the door, he'd build a new one. Still, Eddie's heart wasn't wired for grudges. He loved the guitar too much for that. He once said, "I don't give a fuck if I'm playing a Holiday Inn lounge. I enjoy playing." That line said everything about his spirit. He played for the sheer thrill of creation, not politics, not approval. Music, to him, was an act of joy. And if others couldn't see that, it was their loss. Ironically, years later, Joe Perry would completely reverse his stance. Time has a way of stripping away ego and leaving only truth. In 2013, during an interview covered by Van Halen News Desk, Perry looked back with open admiration. Eddie's playing was just phenomenal. He took everything that he'd heard and put his own stamp on it. I thought, oh my God, this is great. He reinvented guitar playing. Perry described hearing Van Halen's debut album for the first time, completely floored by what he was listening to. I was blown away, he admitted. I kept going back to figure out those little tricks and things. The sound, the energy. It was just so different. For Eddie, that belated respect came too late to erase the sting of those early years, but it spoke volumes about his impact. Even those who once turned away eventually had to acknowledge what he had done, not just for rock, but for the guitar itself. And yet, even at his peak, he never talked down to anyone. The same humility that marked his early disappointment stayed with him. When asked about players from the previous generation, Eddie always spoke with warmth. "They made me want to play," he said. "I wouldn't be here without them." By the time Eddie earned Joe Perry's respect, He'd already stopped chasing anyone's approval. But the next clash wasn't personal. It was intellectual. What happens when Eddie Van Halen collides with the MIT-trained genius who built Boston's perfection from a basement lab? Number 3. Tom Scholz. It was supposed to be just another sunny afternoon show in the late 1970s. Van Halen and Boston sharing a bill, both riding the crest of America's new rock wave. The crowd buzzed, beers in hand, the stage humming with feedback. Eddie Van Halen had just finished his solo, raw, fearless, dripping with adrenaline. The audience was still roaring when Tom Scholz stepped up next. Then, something strange happened. Tom Scholz from Boston, too, Eddie later recalled. We played right before them, I forget where, and I do my solo. And then, all of a sudden, he does my solo. It was real weird, because it was a daytime thing. I was standing on stage and the whole crowd was looking at me like, what's this guy doing? I was drunk. I got pissed. The image stuck with him. Some fans thought Scholz was paying tribute. Others thought he was copying. To Eddie, it felt like theft, not of riffs, but of identity. That irritation grew sharper because Scholz wasn't exactly warm backstage. Eddie described him bluntly. He never comes around. He doesn't say hi, doesn't do anything. Just kind of hides out, runs on stage and plays, and disappears afterwards. The mix of imitation and aloofness stung. Eddie respected confidence, but silence read as arrogance. Tom Scholz, on the other hand, wasn't trying to steal thunder. He was the opposite of Eddie in almost every way. A perfectionist engineer with an MIT master's degree in mechanical engineering, who recorded Boston's debut album in his basement studio. He built his own gear, fine-tuned every frequency, and created the Rockman amp system that shaped arena rock's glossy tone. Where Eddie played by instinct, Scholz calibrated by science. Their worlds collided like oil and water. Eddie was chaos and feel. Scholz was structure and control. One lived for improvisation, the other trusted formulas. And yet both chased the same goal, the perfect sound. Eddie hinted at this frustration in a 1980 interview with Guitar Player. There were guys out there already trying to play what I was doing. The tapping, the runs, all that stuff. Even people who'd been around longer. It's flattering, but it's like, hey man, come up with your own thing. He didn't name Scholz, but everyone knew the reference. Roadies whispered about it for months. To Eddie, originality wasn't optional. It was sacred. He'd built his Frankenstrat by hand, soldering pickups, sawing bodies, and blowing up amps until he found his voice. Seeing someone mirror that sound felt like watching a stranger wear your face. There's a difference between inspiration and duplication, he told Guitar World years later. You can be inspired by someone's playing, that's how we all start. But if you don't evolve, you're just tracing someone else's shadow. Scholz never publicly addressed the story. He was famously private, preferring soldering irons to microphones. Yet his reserved personality clashed naturally with Eddie's open, beer-in-hand charisma. Crew members said Scholz would spend hours backstage adjusting decibel curves while Eddie laughed with fans and swapped guitar tips. Two geniuses, same passion, different planets. Critics loved comparing them. What separated them philosophically was emotion. If you think too much, Eddie once said, you lose it. Music isn't about formulas. It's about feel. That line summed up why Scholz's precision sometimes rubbed him wrong, because to Eddie, imperfection was the magic. Still, mutual respect eventually surfaced. In a rare Boston Globe interview from the early 80s, Scholz admitted, he's got imagination. You can't teach that. And Eddie, decades later, returned the courtesy. The guy built half the stuff he used. That's cool. I respect anyone who gets their hands dirty. Years later, when asked whether it bothered him that others had copied his style, Eddie smiled. If they do, good for them. But they'll never sound like me. Nobody can sound like anybody else. Not really. But while Eddie was learning to live with imitation, another storm was waiting. Colder, sharper, and far more personal. Number 2. Rick Derringer. It's 1978. Van Halen is exploding. The debut album is out. The crowds are wild, and Eddie Van Halen's guitar is rewriting the rules of rock. Every night feels electric, like the sound of the future being born. Then comes the night Rick Derringer opens for them. Derringer's a veteran, a respected player with real history, someone Eddie grew up admiring. But what happens next shakes Eddie to his core. After the show, Eddie walks into the bar, still wired from the adrenaline. He finds Derringer and says, "Hey, Rick, I grew up on your ass. How can you do this? I don't care if you use the technique. Don't play my melody." Eddie's words carry three emotions at once: admiration, betrayal, and a demand for respect. He isn't angry that Derringer used tapping. He's angry that he copied his solo, note for note, melody for melody, in front of the same audience. Inspiration is one thing, replication is another. The next night, Derringer does it again. Same notes, same phrasing, even closing his set with "You Really Got Me," a song Van Halen had already turned into a live anthem. Eddie's patience snaps. He tells Derringer straight, "If you're going to keep doing that, you ain't opening for us." And just like that, Derringer is off the tour. For Eddie, this wasn't ego. It was about identity. Van Halen was still carving its place in history, and Eddie's sound, the tapping, the tone, the volcanic energy was the heart of it. Seeing it mimicked so bluntly, especially by someone he respected, felt like theft. Years later, he admitted, "It's fucked, you know, because I'd copied some of his chops way back then." The sting came not from imitation itself, but from watching a hero cross that line. To understand why it hit so hard, you have to know how Eddie saw music. His father, Jan Van Halen, a jazz musician, taught him early, if you play someone else's song, make it your own. Eddie lived by that rule. Every time he picked up a guitar, he was chasing something no one had heard before. When someone copied his solo exactly, it wasn't just about notes. It was about stealing the soul behind them. By 1979, every guitarist in America was trying to sound like him. Eruption had blown the doors off everything. Magazines obsessed over his secret technique. Players slowed their turntables just to study his fingers. But Derringer wasn't a kid in a garage. He was a peer, a professional, and that made it different. Behind the scenes, the band couldn't stop talking about it. David Lee Roth, ever the showman, joked, "We don't do cover bands, especially not of us." But for Eddie, it wasn't funny. It was a warning. The more famous he got, the more people would try to take pieces of what he'd built. And yet, even in anger, Eddie handled it with rare composure. No public insults, no backstage fights, just a quiet, firm boundary. He drew a line in the sand, not out of arrogance, but out of pride. He'd worked too hard for his sound to let someone else wear it. Over the years, that fury softened into perspective. By the 1990s, Eddie could laugh about it. "It's funny now," he said, "but man, I was hot. I was a kid, and I'd worked so hard for that sound. And then you hear someone just rip it off on stage? You go, no way." Rick Derringer never denied the story, never admitted it either. When asked about Eddie later, he simply said, "He's a monster player. Nobody can touch him." Maybe that was his way of making peace. By the early 80s, Eddie had moved on, building new guitars, inventing new tones, chasing fresh ideas. The Derringer story became just one more moment in a career defined by invention. But it left him with one lasting truth. Being great means being copied. And protecting originality isn't arrogance, it's survival. Years later, when asked about imitators, Eddie smiled and said, "You can copy the licks, but not the spirit." And that's what music is. Spirit. He'd faced imitators, rivals, and even heroes who borrowed his fire. But the next one wasn't about imitation. It was about intimidation. What happened when Eddie Van Halen crossed paths with the man who once ruled the guitar world? Number 1. Randy Rhoads. In the early 1980s, two guitar prodigies stood at the center of rock's storm: Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. Both were young, both were revolutionizing guitar playing, and both were being compared endlessly. For Eddie, those comparisons cut deep. What began as admiration soon turned into rivalry and, perhaps, quiet resentment. Eddie's feelings toward Rhoads weren't built on hatred alone. They were rooted in pride, competition, and the fear of being eclipsed. In Randy Rhoads, Reflections of a Guitar Icon, archive audio captures Eddie reflecting on the young guitarist's rise. His words were sharp, layered with honesty and defensiveness. He was one guitarist who was honest anyway, because he said everything he did, he learned from me. He was good, but I don't really think he did anything that I haven't done. And there ain't nothing wrong with it. I've copied other people, you know? That's classic Eddie. Part compliment, part challenge. He acknowledged Rhoads' talent, but immediately drew a line in the sand. You learned from me. It wasn't arrogance as much as it was Eddie reclaiming authorship of the guitar revolution he started. Tapping, dive bombs, harmonic squeals, all the techniques that defined 80s guitar were suddenly everywhere. And some of those echoes were coming from Randy's fingertips. Rhoads, meanwhile, had come from a very different world. He was classically trained, disciplined, and almost studious in his approach to music. Where Eddie was instinct and fire, Randy was precision and form. Together, they represented the two poles of modern guitar playing, chaos and control. Fans couldn't resist comparing them, and that constant tug-of-war made its way into every magazine headline and backstage conversation. Ozzy Osbourne, who worked with Randy, later responded to Eddie's comments with disbelief. Speaking to Rolling Stone, Ozzy said, "I heard recently that Eddie Van Halen said he taught Randy all his licks. He never. To be honest, Randy didn't have a nice thing to say about Eddie. Maybe they had a falling out or whatever, but they were rivals." That word, rivals, perfectly captures it. This wasn't open war, it was cold competition. Both knew the other was brilliant. Both knew comparisons were inevitable. And in a scene fueled by ego, identity, and innovation, neither wanted to be seen as second best. There's even a story that Rhoads' guitar tech once taped a photo of Eddie Van Halen to the bottom of Randy's wah pedal. Every time Rhoads stepped on it, he was, quite literally, stomping on Eddie. It was half joke, half symbol. It was playful, yes, but also telling. Rhoads wanted to carve his own legacy, free from comparisons, but Eddie's name followed him everywhere. Beneath Eddie's frustration lay something human, vulnerability. He wasn't just a guitar god, he was a man who'd changed the language of rock guitar and was suddenly hearing that language spoken back at him by someone else. When he said he was honest, anyway, it almost sounded like a sigh, a small recognition that imitation, at least when acknowledged, was a form of respect. And yet, there was more than ego in Eddie's words. There was a kind of wounded pride. The guitar scene in the late 70s and early 80s was fiercely competitive. Every player was trying to push boundaries, to be faster, louder, and more innovative. Eddie had built his reputation from scratch, inventing tones, creating the Brown sound, and pioneering techniques that made jaws drop. To see those ideas mirrored by another player, no matter how talented, stirred complicated emotions. Tragically, Randy Rhoads' story ended far too soon. His death in a 1982 plane crash froze that rivalry in time. He never got the chance to evolve beyond the comparisons or to see how his legacy might have intersected or reconciled with Eddie's in later years. For Eddie, that loss probably added another layer of complexity. How do you resolve feelings towards someone who's gone? You can't. The competition remains suspended in memory, unresolved, eternal. In later interviews, Eddie rarely revisited Rhoads directly, but when he did, his tone had softened. The bite was gone, replaced by quiet reflection. Maybe he understood that rivalry and respect were two sides of the same coin, that the reason it mattered so much was because Rhoads was that good. When you think about it, maybe Eddie didn't hate Randy Rhoads at all. Maybe he saw too much of himself in him, and that reflection was both admiration and discomfort in equal measure. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out another interesting video by clicking on the link shown on your screen. See you on the other side.